Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 1305. That's U.S. history to 1877. So for the topic this week, we're dealing with the kind of continuing our discussion of the foundation of the original 13 colonies, the English-speaking colonies or Anglophone colonies of the Americas. And in particular, we're looking at the ones that would really start to grow and flourish in the 18th century, so the 1700s, as opposed to the ones we looked at in our last lecture, which were all being founded and sort of growing to a peak point in the 1600s. And so this week, we're starting with the establishment of the Carolinas. And unlike today, the Carolinas were established as one, there wasn't a North and a South. They were established as one unified colony. And really, when we look at the Carolinas, it's kind of interesting because this is actually where the English first tried to settle, but they didn't have any success in it. They kept trying to settle on the coast of the Carolinas for a long time, but as most of you are probably aware, the weather patterns there are exceptionally violent. Most of where the English were trying to settle originally was in the Outer Banks region. And if you're not familiar with North Carolina's geography, there's a thin bank of basically sandy islands, more or less, hanging right off the coast, and they get just pounded with hurricanes. And so a lot of the early attempts at settlement never really worked because it was such a bad geographic location to actually try and settle. The probably best known early attempt at settlement of the Carolinas, you're probably more familiar with it through American Horror Story than you are through a history class. And that was the lost colony of Roanoke. So this was attempted, there was an attempted push for colonization of this area at the end of the 16th century. In the 1580s, they tried to establish a colony known as Roanoke. And here they drop off 100 colonists, and they settle and establish an early colony on Dare Island, which is just off the coast of North Carolina today. So they were left there, and then there was a boat that was supposed to be going back to Europe to get supplies and then come resupply the colony. So we're talking about the end of the 1500s. They're supposed to be coming back. Well, a conflict breaks out in Europe that stops that boat from coming back for a few years. When the boat comes back to resupply the colony, they're gone. And I wish that, as a PhD holding historian, I could sit here and go, well, I know what actually happened at Roanoke. We don't. We don't know any better than anybody else knows. There's almost no evidence to go on as to what happened to the people of Roanoke. There's a lot of rumors. The only evidence we actually have is that in one of the palisade walls of the fortification at Roanoke, somebody had taken the time to carve into the wood the word Croatoan. Now, there's been a lot of speculation, and I don't think we've come any closer to an answer. But Croatoan, some people theorize that it was a group of Native Americans that were threatening the colony, and therefore the theory is that the colonists were all killed or wiped out by Native American raids. There are other people who are saying the weather is terrible here. We know a hurricane probably rolled through, and they had to abandon the colony, and that the word Croatoan was evidence that they were going to live in another area that they called Croatoan, or that was a Native American group that had offered them safe shelter. There was, when we do see some later colony or colonial attempts in this area of North Carolina, there are European observers who look at some of the Native Americans in the group and they say they don't look like other Native Americans to us. They look like maybe a mix of Europeans and Native Americans. And so other historians have said that lends evidence to the fact that these colonists couldn't live on their own and they had to blend into local Native American populations. Long story short, Roanoke fails because it's a lost colony. We don't know what happened to them. Then a few years after the establishment of Jamestown and the Plymouth colony up in Massachusetts, a guy by the name of Sir Robert Heath was granted a proprietorship to try to establish another colony on Cape Fear in North Carolina in 1629. Now, the problem with Heath is he can never actually get anybody to buy into this endeavor. He can't get the settlers. He can't get more financial backing that he needs. So he never does anything with this charter, and it was invalidated. So he was the original proprietor, but he never actually establishes a colony there. Therefore, it's not really until 1663 that the province of Carolina would become established under a group of people known as the Lords Proprietors. So if you remember me saying a proprietary colony is different from a charter colony or a royal colony. Under a charter colony, a business owns the colony. Under a royal colony, the king or queen owns the colony. But under a proprietary colony, it is owned by an individual. Well, in this case, there were 8 individuals who technically had a claim to the province of Carolina, and these were the Lords Proprietors. Now, Charles II, as you might remember me saying, was restored to the throne after a long civil war in England. And when he's restored to the throne, it is actually these Lords Proprietors are the ones who helped to make this happen. So his way of paying them back is to give all 8 of them a charter to establish the province of Carolina. So that was really the impetus for making this a proprietary colony. But there's a bigger reasoning here as to why the British wanted so badly to establish the province of the Carolinas. And that is because of the Spanish influence down in Florida. The Spanish owned Florida, at that point what they called East and West Florida, and they were seen as a major threat to English colonial aspirations in the Americas. And so they were always worried, the English were always worried about a constant raid by the Spanish out of Florida to take any of their colonies up in the Chesapeake Bay. So they saw the Carolinas as basically a buffer zone. If we put a settlement here, then our most profitable colonies in the Chesapeake Bay are protected from Spanish Florida. And so that was really the reasoning as to why they wanted to establish a colony in the Carolinas. Now, last week we saw a lot of different motivations for what people were trying to do. In the Chesapeake Bay, they were actively producing the cash crop of tobacco, that organized life in that region. And that was really what defines the Chesapeake Bay. When it comes to Maryland, the other Chesapeake Bay colony outside of Virginia, they were established as a Catholic colony. Pennsylvania as a Quaker colony. New York was taken basically to connect the Chesapeake Bay with New England. And so there were all these different motivations for all of this, and each one of these colonies was established for a different reason. The Puritans are really growing the New England Bay colonies as a way to practice religious freedom. Well, when we look at the province of Carolina, you can pretty much sum up the whole history of South Carolina as being tied very innately to the institution of slavery. It is established as a plantation economy, and that has to do with another historical undercurrent that we're going to take a look at. Starting in 1670, roughly 150 colonists moved into the province of Carolina. So shortly after it's established, we see this big wave of colonists come in, and it's worth asking the question, where were they coming from? The fact of the matter is that most of them are coming from the West Indies. More acutely, they are coming from Barbados. And so the English government had passed laws that white plantation owners felt were restrictive to them in Barbados. It didn't give them enough opportunity to grow and acquire more land. And so what they did is they said, forget it. If you're going to put all these weird rules on us that we don't like in Barbados, we're going to take our slaves, we're going to take our money, and we're going to leave. And when they do that, they come to the province of Carolina. And they settle right around modern-day Charlestown, named after King Charles II, who gave the charter to the Lords Proprietors. That would morph into present-day Charleston, South Carolina. And I do want to just point out here that moving forward from that point, Charleston will remain really the hotbed of domestic slave trades. Charleston, South Carolina is deeply, deeply, deeply entrenched in the history of slavery in our nation. And because of this infusion of money, of slaves, and of basically a planter class in this area of Carolina, Charleston in the south grows a lot more quickly than the settlements in the north in Cape Fear. And so, along with these migrants coming in from Barbados, Barbados' slave system that we talked about in our last lecture is going to be moved directly into Carolina with the planters. What that means is the legal relationship between the slave and slave master, the slave being classified as property, something we call chattel slavery, that is going to be imported into the Carolinas. And from there, it will become the model of slavery that's practiced all around the American colonies. And so there is this direct importation of slavery from the island of Barbados. Its planters and slaves move in, and with them they bring the rules and the structure that governs America's slave system with them. There's something else that I want to point out here, is that there are major cultural and economic differences between what will become North Carolina and South Carolina. As I'm talking about now, Charleston is South Carolina's hub. South Carolina is going to become the most firm backbone of slavery in the United States. South Carolina is always going to be the state that's speaking for slavery, the colony that is deeply and heavily invested in plantation slavery. Whereas North Carolina doesn't have that identity, not nearly as much. North Carolina, actually, the early settlement of North Carolina has more to do with the movement of indentured servants, mostly Scots-Irish, people from Scotland and Ireland. They're living in indentured servitude, being forced to work for free in the tobacco culture of the Chesapeake Bay. When they get out of their terms of indentured servitude, they don't really want to go back to England. There's not much for them there, or their homes in Scotland or Ireland. So they choose to move south, and they go into North Carolina out of Virginia. And so it's actually there that they start establishing independent family farms. Long story short, what this means is that South Carolina invests in a heavy plantation culture where you have one really rich slave owner with a big plantation and lots of slaves. Up in the north of Carolina, it's more independent family farmers, people who are just doing subsistence farming to make a living for themselves. And so that's going to give both these regions a real distinct identity. It's distinct in all different types of ways. They make money differently, and their economic outlook is different. The overall socioeconomic position of the people populating both regions is different. And then you have the ethnic makeup is different. It's important to point out that Celts, the people who make up Scots, Irish people, most of the people doing indentured servitude in Virginia, these people are not seen as being equal to Anglo-Americans. They are not Anglo, they're Celtic. It's a different ethnicity, and they're seen as subhumans or sub-Europeans is a better way of putting it. At this point in time, the attitude about the Celts is that there's some sort of mixed up race between Caucasians and Africans. And so that they're looked at as being less than English people, less than Germanic people, less than French or Iberian people. They're on the bottom rung of European society. And so this creates a lot of difference in terms of how these two areas are viewed and how they're going to develop moving forward. So it's going to be run as a single colony up until about 1719, and that's when some major changes are going to start to happen. That's when we start to see the division of the Carolinas into two different colonies. So we know that the 8 Lords Proprietors were granted a charter. Each one of them had a charter for the colony. But in 1719, there is widespread unrest against the Lords Proprietors in South Carolina, and it would lead to the appointment of a royal governor. Really what this is about is those colonists who were unhappy in Barbados with the rules that governed them there, they were equally unhappy with the rules that they were governed by in South Carolina. They wanted to grow. They wanted more land. They wanted more space. They wanted more slaves. They wanted all of these things, and the Lords Proprietors said no. They said no mostly because they're concerned about if we expand too rapidly, we're going to end up fighting a long, expensive, and costly war against Native Americans. And so they didn't want to let these colonists expand, so they said no. This caused riots and unrest in the streets against the Lords Proprietors. So from 1719 forward, they've effectively been kicked out of South Carolina, and they all retreat up to North Carolina. By 1729, the British government is looking to make all of the Carolinas into royal colonies. And so they ask the 7 Lords Proprietors, or they ask all 8 Lords Proprietors, if they will sell their claims back to the crown to make it a royal colony. And 7 of them do. But the 8th family that owns this proprietary charter, grant, is basically, they're going to say, they're the Catharay family, and they're going to be maintaining a big region of central North Carolina known as the Granville District. But they refuse to sell their claim back to the crown. So they're going to run that one area of North Carolina independently from the rest of the colony moving forward. Eventually, England will be successful in buying that proprietary charter back. But both colonies were going to be run as royal colonies, meaning they're directly under the control of the monarch of England from 1729 onwards. But from 1719, they split into North and South Carolina. So that brings us down. We're moving south down the coastline, and that brings us to Georgia. This is the final colony established in the original 13 colonies. So we haven't gone through every single one. We talked at first about Virginia, the first established colony, permanent Anglophone settlement in America. We then moved on to the establishment of Maryland as a Catholic colony. And we talked about New York and Pennsylvania and the sort of unique ways that they became colonies. And then we lumped all of New England in together because it's all the same process that's leading to the formation of those colonies, whether it's Massachusetts or Connecticut or Rhode Island or Vermont or New Hampshire. So those we kind of glossed over the individual colonies to look at it more regionally. Then we have the splitting of both Carolinas, and now we're down to our 13th colony of Georgia. So Georgia's sort of origins date back to 1732. And that's when a proprietary charter was given to a guy named General James Oglethorpe. He was a general in the British Army, and he really, for a long time, had an acute interest in reforming the prison system in England. Particularly what he didn't like was debtors' prisons. He said once you got into a debt, you basically were going to be forced to rot in prison for the rest of your life, and you can never pay that debt back. And he saw a lot of the people in debtors' prisons as being good, otherwise hardworking people that would make good citizens if you gave them a break. And so he was looking at a way to reform the prison system in England and the colonies. That was his main focus. And so when he gets this proprietary charter, he's going to enact rules that meet that end in his colony. So in 1733, he heads out into the wilderness and he camps on a site along the Savannah River. He starts entering into negotiations with the local Yamacraw Native Americans. So once he comes up with a treaty that guarantees him his land and an area to build his new capital, he's going to establish the capital of the new colony of Georgia along the Savannah River. Now, Oglethorpe looks at the establishment of this colony as a unique opportunity. He sees it as a haven for what he calls debtors and the worthy poor. And we got to investigate that idea of worthy poor and what that really means. And another important point that we have to kind of talk about, a subpoint of what I just said, is he got a treaty signed by this group of people called the Yamacraw Native Americans. The thing about the Yamacraws, they're not really a standalone ethnic group or Native American nation. They're actually an amalgamated, they're mixed up group of Lower Creek people and Yamasee people. And the whole point of me bringing this up is not to make sure that you're familiar with local Native American groups. What it's about is, what I want to point out is that one small, I would almost wager to say, not fake, because it's a bad word, but a non-unified group of Native Americans. It's just one small subsection of Native Americans in this larger area we call Georgia, signed away the rights to all of the land for every Native American group involved. And the Yamacraw don't speak for any of the other groups. They don't speak for the Creek people, nor do they speak for the Yamasee people, nor do they speak for the Cherokee or the Choctaw or any of the other Native American groups living in this area. And so that's a major problem, is that one small group decided to sign away the rights for all of Georgia to Oglethorpe when there were other groups that needed to have some consideration and had no say. So now we're going to go back and investigate that idea of worthy poor. On paper, what Oglethorpe would tell you is that the worthy poor is a hardworking person who doesn't drink, he's God-fearing, a good Christian, and he is going to go to church on Sunday, wake up early every day, work. He doesn't swear, he doesn't gamble. None of these things that Oglethorpe sees as negative personal qualities. But here's the difference, is who gets to decide who is worthy in terms of worthy poor? And the answer is, in the early proprietary colony, that would be James Oglethorpe. It's his call. If he doesn't like you, you're not worthy, and you don't get access to his colony. You don't get what everybody else gets. But the point of this colony was that he thought there were a lot of people in debtors' prisons and hardworking laborers in England who weren't being treated fairly, and he wanted to create a haven for them in Georgia. Now, to this end, he passes some unique laws in the early colonies. First and foremost, drinking is outlawed in Georgia. He is not going to allow for any drinking because he doesn't see it as a dignified activity. Therefore, if you're drinking, you're not worthy. You should get out of his colony. Secondly, he outlaws slavery. This is a big move. Now, Georgia is just directly beneath South Carolina. That's a massive slave plantation economy. And Georgia steps forward and says, we don't allow slaves here. Now, it's worth thinking about why this might be. Oglethorpe didn't do this out of altruism. He didn't do it because he was racially enlightened and believed in equality. This was about land usage and who had access to his colony. If I allow slavery in the colony, how does that benefit the working poor? How does that benefit everybody else who needs to make a living? I set this colony up as a haven for people who, one, can't afford slaves, that are too poor for that, and two, are generally going to be working in the agricultural sector, where slave labor is going to drive them right out of the market. They can't compete. And so this is not about believing slavery is wrong. Oglethorpe doesn't believe that at all. He just doesn't think that having slavery in a colony where he's trying to help poor white people get on their feet, having African slave labor there is going to undermine that particular goal. So he doesn't allow for it in the early colony. Now, because of these policies, Georgia just stays stagnant after they're founded. South Carolina's making money hand over fist. They're moving like gangbusters with an export economy that's based on domestic slave labor. So one of the other major trade products on which South Carolina is making a lot of money is the importation and sale of rum. So alcohol is big business. One of the major import products in the colonial America is rum, and it's being brought in from the West Indies and the Caribbean. And so what's happening here is he's saying no rum. So there's a major industry you've just cut out. Georgia can't make money on rum. South Carolina can, Virginia can, Massachusetts can, New York can, everybody else can, but Georgia's not allowed to make money on rum like everyone else. Secondly, you have a lot of people there who move in. They go, I've made a little money for myself. I want to expand. I want to build a big plantation, and I want to employ slave labor. They're looking immediately north and seeing all this money to be had, and Oglethorpe individually is not allowing them to do it. This led to widespread unrest, and he had to reverse all of these restrictions very early on in Georgia's history. In about 1738, alcohol would be allowed into the colony moving forward. Slavery and slaves were legal in the colony moving forward. And so his hand is forced, otherwise he's going to lose his proprietorship over the colony. And so after that, he's eventually going to be replaced, and this will be made into a royal colony later in the history of Georgia. But that is what's unique about Georgia and the foundations of the final colony there. So we've wrapped up the main discussion, which is here are our original 13 colonies. But something else really important happens in the middle of the 18th century. And it all begins with a guy named Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton is an English scientist and mathematician. And right around the mid-1700s, he starts doing these experiments in the mid-1600s, not 1700s. He starts experimenting the laws of motions, optics, and gravity. And ultimately, his experiments are going to alter the course of Western society. And so, Newton's view of the world is way different than the view of the world that came before him. Up until that point, if you were living out in the fields and trying to establish yourself in agriculture, and your crops weren't growing, you would say, that's because God hates me and I haven't been to church in the last 3 weeks, and that's why my crops aren't growing. It's divine. There's some divine origin as to why this isn't happening. I must have sinned. I must have offended God. There was no thought process about maybe I didn't put enough water on the crops, or maybe the pH balance in the soil isn't what it needs to be to grow corn. Any one of these things could be the reason for it. But Newton, everyone knows the story. It's kind of been a mythologized and folkloric story that's been passed down. He's sitting under a tree, an apple falls and jacks him in the head, and all of a sudden he comes up with the idea of gravity. But really, what this is all about, what Newton says, is he says the actual importance of his experiments is this. He says, look, there are laws that govern this world, and they have nothing to do with God. They have nothing to do with Christianity. They have nothing to do with religion. These are physical laws that bound our world, one of which being gravity. And he says, with these laws, there needs to be some ability to see it, observe it, quantify it, and measure how the impact of it's going to play out. That is the beginning of what we call the scientific process. And moving forward, after Newton, after he sort of comes out with this view, and his view of God, he's not an atheist. He doesn't say God doesn't exist. What Newton says is God exists, but he's like a great clockmaker. He made this beautiful world with everything in it, and he turned all the dials and he got it set. But now that it's running, he doesn't care what happens day in, day out on this planet. He doesn't pay any attention to it. He can't kill your crops. You can kill your crops. I can watch and see what you do in your field, and I can observe the thing that's killing your crops. It's real. You're not putting enough water on the ground. That's what's killing your crops. It's not God. It's not sin. It's not any of this. This is a major shift, not just in America, but the entire Western world. All of a sudden, people start to abandon this notion that God and religion are behind every single thing that happens in your day-to-day life, and they start to adopt the idea that God doesn't play a role in it, and we can actually explain these processes we see in the natural world with science and the scientific method. So, on the surface, what happens here is America just blows up. The colonies, all of Western civilization blows up with public libraries, philosophical societies, academic centers, and universities. They all start to flourish. We see the Enlightenment also bringing in an appreciation for the arts and cultural pursuits as well. And when we look at the American colonies, the Enlightenment, this age of Enlightenment that's ushered in by Newton, it starts in the mid-17th century and it's going to play out all the way up into the 18th century. But it's personified in America by Benjamin Franklin. So when we think about Franklin, he's an inventor, he's a scientist, he's a statesman, he's a patriot, a painter, a printer, a reformer. This is a true Renaissance man. So he's not just interested in the scientific method. Funny little side note, he actually invented gutters. So it's just one of those weird things that he invents gutters. He invents a lot of different things. He engages in the scientific method. And a lot of the ideas that when people start challenging this notion that God is at the center of everything and they dictate everything in your day-to-day life, that is going to change the way that people think about their place in this world, their place within a society, within a nation, within a governmental or political structure. And all those things are going to start to get challenged because of the Enlightenment. Because of this scientific shift, people start to challenge the social structures and the political structures that come with them. So, we know that the Enlightenment changes the way that people view themselves in relation to God and the natural world around them. But it also deeply impacts how Westerners understand their relationship to authority, the government, and the nation state that surrounds them. Out of the Enlightenment, we start to see these ideologies that are going to become sort of the core, the crux, the basis of the American Revolution. The whole notion on which our democratically sort of organized society functions, it is all rooted in the Age of Enlightenment. There is a clear pattern of cause and effect. There's the Age of Enlightenment and then the Age of Revolution that follows immediately after. Because people are being spurred on by new ideas and new ideas as to how we can organize ourselves as a state and a government. So we start to see these notions like inalienable rights and the social contract get developed by philosophers once the Enlightenment has started to take shape. When we look at inalienable rights, this is according to the Enlightenment era philosopher. Inalienable rights are rights with which each and every person, they would have said man in their language back then, each and every man are born with these rights. They are entrenched within all people, and it doesn't matter whether you're poor, you're rich, you're somewhere in the middle. Social classification means nothing. And these rights cannot be taken away or denied by any other human being. And so when we look at guys like Thomas Paine and John Locke, these great Enlightenment era thinkers, they say things like the rights to life, liberty, and estates are critical. Every human being has the right to their own life. They have the right to live free. They have the right to own land. That's what they're talking about with estates. Now, to deny a human being any of these rights is not just wrong in the worldly sense. It's actually an affront to God. God gave us all of these rights. And if you're going to come down here and deny a human being these rights, then you are now offending not just the person, but you're offending God too. And it's against the natural order of the world to deny somebody their inalienable rights. As you can see, this doesn't sync up real neatly with the political structure that's in place in England and the colonies. We also look at this idea of the social contract. This is talking about the nature of humanity's relationship to their respective governments. So basically what the social contract is saying is that monarchies and monarchical structures, anything that where you put one person in charge of everybody, it's a false construction. It basically it all goes in the same vein of thinking as inalienable rights. They're looking at monarchs and they're saying kings and queens are people. They're human beings. So why do they get to lord it over everybody else in the nation? And when you look at European society, the answer to that most of the time is they came from the right family. And if you trace this back far enough, they claim what's known as divine rights. They say, God made me in charge of England, and my family in perpetuity is going to run England for the rest of our existence. God wants it that way. That's how they justified being in charge. That's how you justify being the king. But now these new ideas are going, wait a minute. You're a person. You're not a god. You're just a human being. And now because of your position as king, you think you have the right to deny me my inalienable rights? You don't. No one has that authority. And you're actually offending God by saying that you have that authority. So they start to challenge these monarchies. They challenge what's going on politically over in Europe. And this is what leads to the age of revolution. They say, look, nobody voted for the king. They just took power. We have no say. That's not the social contract. The social contract says I have a say in picking how I'm governed. Now, if I get to vote for the king, well, now maybe that's part of the social contract. If I get to have a say in how all of this government has been set up and the laws that you're going to enact on me, that is the social contract. But kings and monarchies don't allow for that kind of discourse. So it goes against this idea. And so because of these shifts, the emergence of inalienable rights, the social contract, it's during the 1700s that we start to see the age of revolutions take shape. This is where we see colonies and nations challenging the idea of divine right monarchies or monarchies in general. So shortly after the Enlightenment takes full swing, we see the United States will be the first nation to fight to throw a revolution. That's going to happen in 1776. And what are they saying? You don't get to tax us over in England if we don't get to vote in Parliament because we're not part of the government. We didn't have a say in it. And that's no good with the social contract. Then there's also the list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence saying, you denied us this inalienable right. You denied us that inalienable right. And so they're playing upon all these Enlightenment ideas to justify why they're going to fight England and fight for their independence. Haiti happened shortly thereafter. France happened shortly thereafter. Gran Colombia down in South America. Mexico in 1821. They're all fighting back against these European governments that are run by monarchies. So this is a pretty major shift in what's going on during this time period, obviously, the way that people are thinking. And this begs another question, especially knowing that we just talked about the establishment of Carolina, and then Georgia later on is going to become a major slaveholding state. How do the ideas of the Enlightenment sync up with this notion of slavery? How do you marry these two things together and not look like the world's biggest hypocrite? And for that, we need to understand the trajectory of the Atlantic slave trade and the West's engagement with African slavery and the Enlightenment and how these two things relate to each other time-wise. So when we go back to the very beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade, it starts in 1460. You got to look at what's going on in Europe in 1460 to understand their psyche and their mindset. Most of Europe is living in feudal arrangements at this point in time. So to go to a European and say, hey, is it okay if I go and grab somebody and I exploit their labor and I make a bunch of money off of it? They're going to go, yeah, that's what happens to me every day. I mean, I live on somebody else's land. I work for basically enough gruel to feed my family in a small shack over my head. I don't make any money. I don't have any say in what I do every day. And on a whim, I can be kicked off this guy's land and forced out into the street and starved to death. This sounds pretty similar to what we know to be slavery, right? And so the feudal arrangements of Europe were so pretty pervasive on the average citizen that the idea of exploiting somebody else for their labor, that happens to me every single day. So why is it not good enough for somebody over in Africa? If someone can exploit my labor every day, why can't you exploit his too? And so you have to understand that it's not there's a constant argument in Atlantic world history about this idea. It's kind of a chicken and the egg thing. What came first, racism or slavery? And it's this kind of argument back and forth. And well, obviously the two feed into each other. You need to take time period into account. You didn't need to be racist to engage in slavery at the beginning of the slave trade. You're just tapping into another source of labor. But when we get to the Enlightenment, this is the exact same time period that the Atlantic slave trade is taking off. It's growing rapidly. It's turning from a trickle into a torrent, a rush. It's about to grow by about 10% every decade moving forward from 1680 up to 1800. And so, obviously, with Enlightenment era ideals, inalienable rights, the social contract, this forces a reexamination of the slave trade. You have to think about this. And it's going to give rise to more complex abolitionist organizations and arguments. More and more people are going to look at this and say, how can you put somebody into slavery if you say you believe that one right you can't take away from any man is liberty? That's the first one, right? So you can't take anybody's liberty away. So, but here's the problem. The money is too big. The money that is held in the Atlantic slave trade at that point in time for European nations, for the colonies in the Americas, it's just too much money. So Europeans are going to go through mental gymnastics. And in my humble opinion, as somebody who is a scholar and an expert in this particular field, I think that you see the birth of modern white supremacy and modern day racism comes out of the mental gymnastics that are being done to somehow say, I believe in enlightenment, and I believe all these theories are true. Yeah, I really like the money I get from owning a plantation down in South Carolina, and I don't want to give it up. Now I have to come up with some new way of justifying what I'm doing. And so here we go. This is how they do it. You go, no man can have their rights to life, liberty, and estates, and then later that will morph into the pursuit of happiness, taken away from them. You as a human being don't have that right to take it away from them. How are you going to own a slave and believe that previous statement is true? I'm going to look at the slave and go, he's not a man. He's property. I own him, and he's like a cow or a tractor or anything else that I might own on my plow. That's what he is. So by denying his basic humanity, I also deny that he has any access to inalienable rights. Now here I am. I'm a believer in the Enlightenment. I believe in the notions, but I also get to keep my profits from slavery. And so here's what they start to do. Here come the mental gymnastics. This is what they're going to do. Racial differences, that's the key. Well, he's a black guy from Africa. I'm a white guy from Europe. So he's not a man. I'm a man. I have inalienable rights. He doesn't have inalienable rights. Problem solved. I can still believe in both things, and I haven't really made myself a hypocrite. I'm going to go down and I'm going to say, well, actually, you know what I'm doing? It's actually a benefit. I'm actually putting him in a position where he can understand his inalienable rights because he comes from a backward civilization that doesn't understand any of these developments. Better off being a slave in a civilized country than being a slave in Africa. And that's the sort of justification. They start actually believing these things. They start putting this out in writing. You see an explosion of basically slavery apologist literature right after the Enlightenment. As much as you see a rise in abolitionist literature, you see an equal rise in pro-slavery literature. And it's because they know this doesn't sync up with your ideas anymore. Far too often, modern-day slavery apologists will try to make you believe that everybody thought slavery was all right in the 1700s. That's not true. It's simply not true. A lot of people thought it was wrong. And anybody who really truly bought into Enlightenment era thought believed it was wrong. but money was too big and they weren't going to give up the profits from slave trading and slave usage. So that's a really important shift that happens during this time period. And like I said, it's an opinion. I share it with a number of other Africanists and Atlantic world historians. But it is my belief that we start to see the origins of modern racism and white supremacy comes out of the mental gymnastics that are done to marry together slavery and new Enlightenment era ideologies. So, moving along, the next subject we need to address is the Great Awakening that's happening between 1730 and 1770. Basically, this, and when you see it on an exam, this what you need to know about the Great Awakening is that it is a series of religious revivals that occur across the American colonies, and they are a response. They are reactionary to the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment puts a lot of pressure on religion and Christian ideology at this point in time. So basically, most Christians will get used to saying, if something went wrong, it's because you didn't do right by God and he's pissed off at you and you need to propitiate yourself before him and make amends. Most people are going to be saying the reason that this happened was God. Well, now a bunch of people have come along and said, nah, he's got nothing to do with it. God doesn't even care. God stopped watching the planet Earth back when it was created. So he doesn't care what we do on a day-to-day basis. This challenges a lot of people's belief system. And the reaction, the people who don't want to accept this new way of thinking, who want to reject the scientific process and reject the impact this has on life around us on the day-to-day basis, they are going to turn even more heavily to religion. They say that basically the Enlightenment is wrong, that all it's done is decentralize God, and we've lost our way. And so they are going to go through this series of religious revivals where there are very emotional styles of preaching. They're big revival, they're meetings out in the middle of the woods. People get together in big tents, and you have a very forceful, emotional preaching style. This is what we call New Lights, this emotional style of preaching. They don't believe in this. This is where you scream and you shout and you throw your hands in the air and you drop on your back and you start rolling around and talking in tongues because you've been touched by the Holy Spirit right then and there. And it was too much for you to take. This is in stark contrast to the type of religion that was practiced in the American colonies before. It was a lot more like the way I teach my classes, very explicatory, where I'd stand up. And the reason that you should believe in God is because of A, B, and C. Now, I've connected the dots, and I made a very good, very convincing argument for you. Okay, have a nice rest of your Sunday. That's the style of preaching that's going on amongst the old lights. The new lights are freaking out by comparison. When you look at them relative to the old lights are going, these people are nuts. They have lost their minds. But this is a different expression of religion. And what it is it's meant to reject Enlightenment era ideas. It's meant to say we've become far too engrossed in consumer economies. We're far too concerned about how to get better crop production and output. We're more concerned about money than our eternal souls. And now we've had this new idea come along that says God doesn't even care what happens in our day-to-day life. And so this group is going to usher in a whole new style of religion into the colonial setting. And one of the areas they target most heavily is non-European Americans. They're looking to convert a lot of different types of people. Women, actually, who don't have a voice in public during this time period, are able to go to these awakenings. And while they're not preachers, they're not allowed to go up and speak to the group. They can be saved, and they can shout and profess their faith right there in public, something they couldn't do in other avenues of American colonial life. So it gave a lot of leverage to non-white males to come together. This is sort of an intercultural mixing area, and it gives a voice to women to voice their opinions on religion and their eternal soul in this time period. Another group that is going to specifically be targeting non-whites during the Great Awakening is a group of German evangelists known as Moravians. They are incredibly successful at reaching out to Native Americans and African Americans. And that's because they are going to use dramatic imagery, and they play upon some certain aspects of Christianity that would appeal to these two groups. So what we tend to see here is during the First Great Awakening, the Moravians, they know, if I go and I take a Bible and I drop it on the lap of a slave who's not allowed to read and write, what's he going to do with a Bible? I'll use it to prop up my pillow at night. That's about what it's worth to him because he can't read it. And so there's no point just going and handing somebody a Bible and saying, read it, be touched, and convert. So they know they need to use pictures. Pictures are understood by everybody. And in particular, they play upon the crucifixion of Jesus because this speaks to non-European converts. Amongst African religions, amongst Native American religions, there is a common thread where self-sacrifice and suffering creates strength and redemption. And that's the exact story that we're seeing kind of play out in the crucifixion of Jesus. And so they use that imagery. They love to show that image to potential converts who can't read because those people are going to be moved by that image. And it speaks to a religious idea that they already carry with them. So many enslaved individuals gravitate towards Christianity during the First Great Awakening. It's really, really important to them because they actually see it as what we call a type of liberation theology. What they think is redemption in the eyes of God means redemption for me here on this planet as well. And God will actually deliver me from slavery. Some Native Americans take to this revivalist movement, and they would actually play the role of cultural interpreters. They would go around actually kind of connecting Native American groups with non-Native American groups because they could eventually learn to speak English. They're eventually going to convert to Christianity, and they can kind of work as go-betweens in the mid-17th century. Other Native Americans felt that these revivals, coupled with the really pervasive influence of alcohol on their societies, were all part of a larger problem, and they tend to reject all forms of European influence. And they don't want to see any of it in Native American society. Okay, so that is the Great Awakening, the Moravians and their type of evangelism. And talking about Native American relationships, it's kind of a good entry point to the French-Indian War. This is a critical conflict that most Americans don't know anything about, but actually it is the French-Indian War that leads to the revolution. Before we dive into the nuts and bolts of the French-Indian War, we got to look at how things are playing out in the Americas. Remember, the French still control the area of the Mississippi River. They're still up in the Great Lakes region, up in my neck of the woods, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana. That's where Canada, they're all up in that area. So they have much better relationships with Native Americans. They foster something called the middle ground method of intercultural interaction, and it's extremely successful. There are three factors that make the relationship between the French and the Native Americans much better than the British or Anglo-Native relationship. First and foremost, the French, they were mostly just working age men here, so they ended up sleeping with a lot of Native American women. This fostered what they called a very sizable métis or biracial class, half French, half Native American kids that brought these two communities closer together. Secondly, neither side really looked to impose its will on the other. They fostered successful trade relationships. You want something that I have, I want something that you have. We can find a middle ground and negotiate. That worked really, really well. Finally, the French simply aren't here in great enough numbers to be a threat to Native Americans. Native Americans look at the English and they go, got a lot of those guys floating around. The French, not so much. And so ultimately, the relationship between the English and the Native Americans was way worse than the French and the Native Americans. The British don't readily mix with Native Americans, and they are altering the landscape through sheer numbers. They're making previous existence patterns to Native Americans pretty much impossible. And so what you're going to see here is the Native Americans look at the French on one side and the English on the other, and they say, if I got to pick a side, I'm going with the French because the English are very, very disruptive and very dangerous. They represent a huge threat. The French, not so much. So in 1754, the French-Indian War would break out. And we call it the French-Indian War because the French and the Indian parties aligned against the English. So this is part of a larger war. There's something called the 7 Years' War going on in Europe. This is where France had formed a grand coalition. They reached out to the Netherlands and Spain and Portugal and all these other in Germany. And they said, look, the British and the Russians are growing huge. And they're getting too big for the rest of us. They're going to take everything and drive us out of existence. And so they formed a grand coalition to fight the British and the Russians. Warfare breaks out all over the world, actually, and it spreads over to North America. And the French Indian War is just the North American theater of the 7 Years' War. So really, it's about the English versus the French, but the French also have their Native American allies on their side. So France starts by building up a whole bunch of forts in a very heavily contested area in between English settlement and French settlement. This is the Ohio River Valley. They start putting these forts up all over the place. And so basically it's to defend their settlements. But the British look at that and say, well, there's a target, a military target I can raid and take, and that will establish my control over the Ohio Valley. In the first raid, the start of the French-Indian War begins with a young George Washington failing to take a fort known as Fort Duquesne, just outside of present-day Pittsburgh in 1754. Washington and his men have to crawl back to the East Coast with their tail between their legs, and he learns a couple real good lessons in this war before the American Revolution. Because Native Americans have better relations, they are going to be siding with the French against the British for the most part. There are a few Native American groups that do side with the British, but they're very small, very few and far between. The majority of Native Americans go with the French. So all of a sudden, we have this conflict in the Ohio River Valley. And between 1756 and 1760, the British are going to double their efforts. They put twice as much manpower to try to drive the French from their forts in the Ohio River valleys, and they're successful in that. By 1760, they've chased the French up into the Great Lakes, and it becomes exceedingly important to win the naval battle in the Great Lakes. And the British are always going to be the stronger of the two naval powers. So they're really pushing the French back up into Canada, and the French retreat back to Quebec, their colonial capital of what is New France. So they go to colonial Quebec, and that's when, in 1760, the British invade Quebec, and they take Quebec as well. And so once the French have been overrun in their colonial capital, they've been outgunned, outmanned. The war does drag on for about 3 more years, but it becomes very clear that the French are going to lose this war. The British are going to end up on top. And so by 1763, the war is all but finished. This is going to make a major, major impact on American history for a couple of different reasons. For now, it suffices to say that France had to give major portions of its colonial holdings in the Americas over to England. So basically, all the areas that were owned by France, they're going to just automatically convert over to being English-speaking colonies. So that's okay for the French because the French are gradually pulling out of the Americas. They're especially North America. They're looking more down towards the French Antilles, areas like that. Now, there's a lot of major outcomes from the French-Indian War. Number one, England gets control of this massive swath of North America. They get all of France's colonial holdings in Canada. They get the entire Great Lakes region. They get the modern American Midwest. They get all of France's holdings along the upper Mississippi River. Now, a bunch of different Native American groups had joined the French. One of the most notable ones that's talked about in your textbook is Pontiac's Rebellion. Now, here's the problem. They are still in this. This is their home. The French go, well, heck, we lost. We're out of here. Well, guess what? People like Pontiac and other Native Americans who fought alongside the French, they're left there, and now it's English territory. The English govern and own this territory on paper. And so what ends up happening is the Native Americans living in this area are going to basically be, they're going to be persona non grata. They just picked up arms and tried to kill the British, and now they're under British control. As you can imagine, they're not going to be viewed very favorably by Anglo-speaking colonists or the British government at large. Now, another interesting point is during the French-Indian War, this is where a lot of the British colonists living in the Americas learned guerrilla warfare tactics. When they were being attacked by the Native American groups, this is something that they're going to have to use again when they get into the American Revolution. They take the tactics that were used against them, and then they are going to use them against the British. Finally, the biggest outcome of the French-Indian War is the fact that the British do not want to further antagonize their Native American neighbors. Now, what they're going to do is issue something called the Proclamation of 1763. This states that settlers, American colonists, English colonists in America, would not expand westward beyond the Appalachian Mountain Range. Now, this is really, really, really important because the British government looks at this and goes, I knew the Native Americans weren't real fond of us. I didn't know they hated us that much that they were willing to die alongside the French to take us out. So they really start to feel like, we need to back off and leave the Native Americans alone. The colonists don't feel the same way. Native Americans are just impediments, things to be moved out of the way so we can expand and grow. So you're already seeing a disconnect between the British and their colonists on the ground in the American colonies. That proclamation goes a long way towards fueling discontent in the American colonists. They are not happy about it. Finally, and I'm kind of giving you a preview of this because we're not going to deal with it until we come back and talk about the American Revolution. But here's the simple fact of the matter, and here is the easiest way to see a pattern of cause and effect going on here. The French Indian War and the 7 Years' War cost the British government so much money that when it all came to an end, they had to turn around with their hands out to American colonists and go, you guys have to start paying more taxes. This has got to happen. You need to pay more in taxes. You don't pay as much as everybody else in the empire. It's time to start paying. And it's because they're trying to get rid of this debt, this deficit they accrued from the war. And it's actually that is the reason that the British are going to start taxing American colonists in the first place. And over time, that's going to lead to that call of no taxation without representation that will dovetail directly into the American Revolution. All right, that wraps it up for my lecture this week. If you have any questions, comments, any problems, anything you need to talk out, feel free to shoot me an email at davyj@uhd.edu. Take care.